You should have seen who I beat out. I'm not allowed to name any names. Rhymes with Monathan Manzan. It's a pleasure to be at Book Passage and with Tom Barbash, which represents to me a Venn diagram of the two things I like most about Marin County. We Californians have long revered Tom Barbash as our adopted own, not only as an esteemed writer of fiction and non, but as a longtime champion and supporter and organizer and flag waver and enthusiast and careful reader and advice giver and editor in other people's work. Basically, I think around town, Barbash has one of the greatest gaps between his own literary talent, which is very high, and his level of assholishness, which is extremely low. Because we get a lot of this. And then we get some of this, which is like worse. So he's long been a pleasure to know as much as he has been a pleasure to read. His new book is a book of stories. It is titled Stay Up With Me, which is, I was trying to think of other books that contain the thing that you want to do with the book in their title. It's a complicated parlor game, and I can do nothing good. You do want to stay up with me. It is a terrific book, but it's a certain kind of terrific. I'm just going to take a couple sentences to say the kind of terrific that it is, because there are some kinds of terrific books who like to put on a show and kind of wear a fancy outfit and set off fireworks so that you can't help but notice what kind of terrific they are. And then there are terrific books that work more like a terrific pickpocket. And that is this book. It's an incredibly immersive, I swore I would only read a little bit before bed, and now tomorrow I'll just be tired all day kind of books. I got my copy on Friday. Saturday morning I got up, my kid was away, what a blessing. And I sat on the sofa with a cup of coffee and I thought, I'll just read like 2, and then I'll go on my day and I'll carry it with me and I'll read. And then at like 3 p.m., no fooling, I had to well, there's only 2 left. You're still in your pajamas. So it will wreck your day in a glorious way. And Mr. Barbash will now read one of the stories from the collection, and then I will ask him some questions using Book Passage's patented second lousy mic. And the questions will be the questions that I'm really curious about with the book, which won't match yours, and so we will then open the floor up to you, and then you will buy several copies of Stay Up With Me by the man of the hour, Mr. Tom Barbash.
That was really wonderful, Dan. So this is sort of, I guess, my home court, my home turf. And, yeah, so that's where I wanted to begin. And I love this bookstore, and it means a lot to me. So, and I love a lot of people in this room, or I would say all of you, since you're here. And it's so great. This is the launch. This is the first day, and this is where it's the book is taking off into the world. And so I'm going to read a story called Somebody's Son, and it's one of the upstate New York. There's a few upstate New York stories and a lot of New York City stories. And I won't read the whole story, but I'll read a good part of it. And I'm going to begin. There's Eddie and Randall are 2 young men who are in the Adirondacks, and they have come over to the home of some elderly people who own a nice big house with a lot of land in the Adirondacks, and they're trying to ingratiate themselves with the older couple so they can buy the house cheaply and sell it for a lot of money. And so I'll join it. They've just sort of begun the sale, and they sort of have done well in terms of charming the people, and then I'll start there. So I excuse myself to go to the bathroom. Mrs. Berner points the way and lets me loose in her house. I think about us sitting there in the Berners' living room and it makes me angry at them. There's no reason to be so trusting in a world like ours. A couple of months ago, I read an article about an old couple that let a man into their house supposedly to fix their stove. They didn't even have a problem with their stove, but they trusted him. And when they let him inside, he pulled a pistol on them. He made them lie down on the ground. He took everything they had in the house, and before he left, he must have thought they'd had a long enough look at his face because he shot them both dead. I wander through the cold, drafty rooms of the Berners' house, and I think about us being homicidal maniacs. We're invited guests in their house, and there's no one around to hear us or see us, no witnesses, and there's plenty here to rob. I sold at an antique shop one summer, and the Berners have possessions lying around that would bring a decent price. Old snow globes, a gilded music box, mahogany it looks like. A tall grandfather clock with Westminster chimes in the wrong time, standing in the corner like a forgotten cathedral. A 1950 Winchester 12-gauge and an otherwise empty gun rack. A reading lamp with a silk shade and glass bead fringe. I flick the switch, but then I see there's no bulb. There's beautiful stuff here that doesn't look like it's been touched for years. Would they miss it if it was all gone one day? In the drawers of a maple chest in the dining room, there are dusty porcelain teacups so thin they might crack the instant you lifted them to your lips. We could steal everything in this house if we wanted, and they probably wouldn't notice. In the bathroom, I pick up crystal and silver perfume bottles, a magnifying glass with a mother-of-pearl handle that rests atop a pile of ancient Life magazines. I pocket one of the perfume bottles, covering it with tissues taken from the nightstand. On my way back, I hear Eddie laughing too loud and saying, "You're exactly right. You're 100% on the mark." Eddie gives him his card before we go, and he holds Mrs. Berner's hand in his. "If you decide you need a change, give Randall here a call. I think we can work a nice deal for all of us." He turns to me. "I'll wait for you in the car," he says. "He wants me to establish myself here. It will be my sale. And it'll be easy. They're already leaning our way. They even like us, for God's sake." On my way out the door, I pull the perfume bottle out from the tissues, and I hold it at my side, right there for them to see. Eddie's out in the car waiting. I stand in the doorway. "Is there anything else I can answer for you?" I say. She sees nothing. "No," she says, "but I'm feeling sure there will be." Eddie has me going it on my own so that he can move to other properties. In the last year, he's managed to buy 2,000 acres of woodlands and waterfront in the Adirondacks, and our company has bought around 7 times that. And these people really need the money from the looks of them. $90,000 buys a new car, flat screen TV, stereo and disc player, medicine and food for the next 3 years, and a house on Collins Street, a block from the general store. Eddie's girlfriend says it's the Adirondacks. It's a special part of the country, and it is. 6 million acres. Almost half of it unmarked, not even a logging road or snowmobile trail. The Hudson River starts up not too far from here in Lake Tear the Clouds. It's a lake almost a mile high, and I've been swimming there. It's not as if we're building factories or a toxic waste dump. The houses and cabins we build are beautiful, state-of-the-art, high ceilings, fireplaces, wraparound porches, and the outsides are left their natural wood color or painted brown or grass green so they blend in with the earth. The way Eddie tells it, we're giving people their retirement, and we are. But we're also making some coin. Like the Berners' 300 acres, we'll split it into 8 lots, each with a calendar picture of unspoiled Adirondack riverfront, and each selling for about 4 times what we'll pay the Berners. Our company places ads in the New York Times with pictures of the Oswegatchie, of the Triple Falls, the water dropping into spruce green eddies, 5 hours from the city and you're in God's backyard. People can't afford to buy beachfront anymore. They're sick of the suburbs, the shopping malls. We're giving them what they've been missing their whole lives. There's an interview process for the people who want to buy. We want people who will respect the land, Eddie says, who love the outdoors. People will be good neighbors. I've never seen him turn down a buyer because he thought he'd be a bad neighbor. But people like to be interviewed. They want to think they've passed a test. "Where'd you go?" he asked on the drive from the Berners. I wasn't feeling that well. I think they're very interested. You need to get to know them. It's like I've been saying, low pressure. No one wants some salesman breathing down their necks. They don't trust that. Call them up in a few days just to talk. Don't ask her anything except how she's doing, the weather, Mr. Berner, and things like that. And she'll invite you in for pie, I guarantee. And tell her things about yourself. Ask her advice on something. I swear it changes everything. Get them involved in your life a little. The sale has got to be secondary. We push too fast, like you were starting to do in there, and people smell a rat. We pass through rugged forest on our way into town. What kind of things do I tell her about myself? Tell her about your family, about your mom and dad, and how you worry about them from time to time. Tell her about visiting them. What that does, it makes you into a son. You're a salesman here, but you're also somebody's son. See what I'm saying? I'm renting a 3-room apartment directly above Luttrell's General Store and across Collins Street from the post office. In the mornings, I buy a cup of coffee and I sit in the back with the regulars, a bunch of old guys in baseball caps who smell like cigarettes. Vern Luttrell knows me by name now. I know most mornings, though once he called me Andy and another time Patrick. I corrected him both times because I want him to remember me. I want everyone around here to remember me because I will be here for a while. Eddie introduced me around the first week here. They all like Eddie. A couple of them have gone fishing with him. One old guy took him hunting. Eddie Callahan from Westchester County, gumming around the woods hunting for deer. I tried to talk the way Eddie talked with him, loose and comfortable, one of the gang, but the words always came out wrong, stiff and unnatural, or else exaggerated as though I were mimicking them. Now Eddie's moved away to meet another town full of homeowners, and he's left me behind as the new Eddie. No one has asked to take me hunting. In a few days I call Mrs. Berner. She knows my voice before I identify myself. I was hoping you'd call, Randall, she says. Have you gotten settled in yet? All settled in at Eddie's old place on top of Luttrell's, I say, right there in the middle of town. You must be a little restless, huh? What do you mean? Not much for a young man like you to do around there, especially a young man whose roots are downstate. I like it. I'm getting to know everyone, all the regulars at Luttrell's. That's a lazy bunch of do-nothings. Weather, I think. Days have been beautiful, huh? For October, I can't believe it. Is it always this beautiful? Sunshine blazes my window. It's usually colder, but it's always beautiful. I think you're right, I say. She says nothing, I say nothing. I can't think of anything else. She suspects me, I think. She knows about the perfume bottles. Good for her. Good for them. I'll say goodbye, I decide. Randall? Her voice creaks. Do you like grilled cheese sandwiches with Virginia ham and tomato? Yes, I say. Well, I do too. I would like you to come over to the house and have a sandwich with me. Mr. Berner is in bed with the flu, she says. From time to time we hear a frightening cough from the other room. She brings him his sandwich. I wait from the doorway. He waves back pathetically. Hello, Randall, he calls out. Nice to see someone so young and healthy. The rooms are so large, I can't imagine how they heat the place in winter. I can't imagine old Mr. Berner sick. I can imagine old Mr. Berner sick all winter in that cold house. In the living room, Mrs. Berner and I sit across from each other, me on the blue couch, her on the cloth-lined rocker. We've been discussing what you and Eddie brought up the other day. I'm starting to think it might make a whole world of sense. Too fast, I think, hold back. But you've been here so long, I say. It's got to be hard to think of moving from here. We'll go broke living here, and we don't get out that much to appreciate it that much anyhow. I eat my sandwich. It's hot and gooey and as good as anything I can remember eating. I'm lonely all the time, she says. You think you're teaching a lesson. She looks so sad, I feel the need to cheer her up. My mother and father are both retired, and they get such a kick out of my coming home, I say. My mother makes a big deal of it, and she cooks some terrific meals. Sometimes my brother comes home at the same time. Family is important to me. What do your parents do? Well, my father's a school custodian, and my mother's a secretary in the military. She works for the Army. Neither of these are true. I haven't seen either of my parents in more than 5 years. And so I couldn't say precisely what they do. It doesn't seem like Mrs. Berner hears me anyhow. My mother just finished a tour in Kabul, I tried. I wish you'd come by whenever you like and visit us, Randall, she says. On the way back from the bathroom this time, I take the magnifying glass. I hold it at my side the way I did the perfume bottle as I say my goodbyes. Mrs. Berner says nothing about it. She ducks back inside. On the way to my car, I swipe the newspaper from the blue plastic box. That night I meet Eddie at a bar in Saranac Lake. He has 2 more prospective sellers lined up, another old couple and a 93-year-old widower. He's doing chores for the widower, bagging leaves and painting. I let him pay me a few dollars and a beer each time so he doesn't get suspicious or anything. I haven't even told him I work in real estate. What did you tell him? I told him I was a social worker on sabbatical. Eddie buys the beers and asks the bartender to make out a receipt. He knows the bartender's name and asks him about fishing on a particular section of the river. Caught 2 today, the bartender answers. Walleyes have been hitting, Eddie, but it's just panfish, nothing too big. I can't even catch a cold lately, Eddie says. It seems to me there are a few people Eddie doesn't know. What's new with the Berners, he asks me when the bartender's out of earshot. Grilled cheese and Virginia ham today, hamburgers and peach cobbler on Sunday night. Nice, he says, nice. I'm following your advice. I'm taking it slow. Good, good. You're making a friend here, not a sale. A friend, remember that. You're helping them to get to where they need to go. They can't survive in that place. When you're getting close, let me know, and I'll write you a check, and you can take it over. She'll cry, I guarantee. She'll take one look at that $90,000 check, and she'll cry. I know he's speaking the truth. In 2 or 3 meals, Mrs. Berner, Aurelia Berner, will do whatever I tell her because she trusts me and because she's lonely and wants to keep me as her friend, or maybe as a fill-in for the kids who left for California. And I think that if it weren't me, it would certainly be someone else taking her money. And it isn't her money anyhow. It would be her money if she knew what her home was worth, and she doesn't. So why should she make a fortune off the house and property she can't even use anymore? Each time I visit the Berners, I take something else. 2 of the snow globes, an old copy of Robinson Crusoe, a porcelain doll. I take 3 more perfume bottles. As we walk in the house, I sometimes run my hand over the place where I took an object or 2. I wonder where she keeps her cash, the money she probably pays a neighborhood kid to do her grocery shopping. I asked her once if she needs someone to do her grocery shopping. I pick up a load of groceries for her, and when I return with them, I tell her they cost twice as much as they did. I want her to question me, to ask for a receipt. Instead, she hands me $50 for some old coconuts and fruit, bread, vegetables for a salad, and a few boxes of rice. Old Man Berner marks me some trails he hiked when he could walk and tells me what I'll see. Thick red spruce and those nice fir trees in the highlands, and lower down the sugar maples we get our syrup from, and beech and yellow birch and animals, Randall, that you can't see anywhere else. Indian bats, grouses and loons, worm snakes and bog turtles and turkey vultures. He reminds me a little of a turkey vulture, though I don't tell him that. After a month or so, Eddie calls me in my room. Did you get the check I sent? He asks. My room looks like an antique shop. My place is filled with beautiful items taken from the Berners' house. I've dusted them all. I collected enough money from 2 things I sold to buy a secondhand TV and an electric razor. Soon I will have a great deal more than that. Eddie will pay me 3% of the profits, which could bring me about $8,000. They want out of there, Eddie. They're ready to sign whatever I bring over. Get her to sign and then give her the check. Make it fair. $90,000, just like we talked about. We're not in the business of ripping people off. We can't get that reputation. It's clear he's convincing himself here and that he'd want to pay less. If he could get away with it, Eddie would buy their land for $24, like the deal Peter Stuyvesant worked out for me. The next weeks are freezing cold. The roads ice solid and scary to drive on. The winds whip harshly through whatever I put on. The snows come strong out of nowhere, and I'm forever scraping ice from my windows, knocking it from under my boots. On my way home from the Berners one night, I'm stuck in a whiteout, white all around me, and I can't tell which direction is forward. There aren't any sounds. My tires are high off the road in a snow cloud. I slowed about 5 miles an hour, and then I cut the engine. I step out of the car and let the snow fall on me, and for just a moment, I feel like a 6-year-old. When I get back in and start driving again, it takes me 2 hours to go a distance that should take 20 minutes. At night, I watch TV just to hear the voices. I take long walks and then I turn on the news. There's a small mention of the man who killed the old couple in Utica. He claims he never meant to kill them. He meant to rob them, but the old guy pulled out a knife. The reporter said the knife was the old man's Swiss Army knife and the blade was smaller than 4 inches. On the night of a particularly loud and icy storm, I barricade myself in blankets against the sound outside. I wear layers of sweaters and shirts. Before I go to sleep, my phone rings. Randall? It's Mrs. Berner. There are 2 windows I can't get closed. They're wide open and the heat's going right through them. I'm afraid Mr. Berner will freeze if we don't get the windows closed. They're hard to close even for me. I pull and then I begin banging on them. I pour steaming water in the openings and then smear butter on the hinges. The cold air washes against my face. Finally, one budges, and in another few minutes, I've got the other closed. Mrs. Berner gasps, and then she gives me a beautiful smile. We sit in her kitchen and drink hot chocolate, and the sound of old Rory Berner snoring loud and steady comforts us both like the sounds of the logs crackling in the wood-burning stove. Sunday, the sun comes out strong. The ground begins to thaw. I eat turkey at the Berners. Mr. Berner eats a few bites of dinner with us and then heads back to bed. I guess we've been pressing our good luck, Mrs. Berner said. He's getting worse living here. He's going downhill. After dinner, I bring out the papers. Mrs. Berner looks them over closely. She shuts me out for a while, and I think for a moment she might lose her nerve and decide to stay, but then she looks up at me and smiles. You might want to think about this a while. I have, she says. Where do I sign? I show her. No, I give you this check for $90,000. You fill out a check for $2,000, and make it out to me. That's a transaction fee. Transaction fee. Okay. That leaves you with 88,000. That's plenty, she says. And then we have nothing to say to each other. I drink my hot chocolate and she drinks hers. Half an hour later, I pull my coat on to leave. Randall, she says before I'm out the door. Yes, I say. We want you to have those things. I wanted you to know that. What? The things you've been taking? We want you to enjoy them. I feel dizzy suddenly. I can hear Mr. Berner coughing. You're welcome to have anything of ours you want. We don't have anyone to give things to anymore. You know what that's like? Thank you, I said. I picture our things in your little apartment over the general store. I picture you taking them into your home when you buy one. You'll have a nice home one day. Maybe you'll choose to stay around here. We'd like you to. We'd like you to think of us as your family. Thank you, I say. I tell her I'll help her move. You're not who you think you are, she says, before I can get away. Give it time, I know. You'll find your peace. The door is open, but I stand still and seen before her, unable to move, overcome with a feeling I cannot name, the sense of being followed. You think you're stealing, but it's yours, don't you see? Always was. You're forgiven, Randall. Money shouldn't divide. The past is over and done. It's clear from her honest she's talking about someone else, someone she blames herself for losing years ago, but I pretend she's talking to me. We love you very much, she says. I know that, I say. Thanks.
Sure.
Or I can just
absolutely. I think you should stay there on the podium where you we can put you up on a pedestal. That was terrific. I don't think there was a person in the room not electrified by Mrs. Berner saying, "We want you to have those things." So I want to ask you a couple questions about that story, actually, because we're all still in it. Was that, how did something like that come together for you? Was that the moment? To me, the center of gravity of that story is that moment where this room got palpably shamed and uncomfortable, which is the sign of your great hypnosis that you go over. Was that the moment for you?
Yeah, the story doesn't work without the sort of second story of what she's getting, and the fact because he's been so dismissive of her, and then so it was sort of late in the process where I sort of figured out that these are two people who are trying to get things out of each other. You know, they're both bringing different things to bear on it, and the idea of him thinking that he can hide everything, and the likelihood that she's seen all these things too. And then also it plays with the notion, I think, of people wanting to be caught, wanting to do things, and especially someone who's lacking his parents, that idea of being sort of seen and someone else who's watching and make mistakes. But if nobody cares about the mistakes, that's almost worse than anything, so you may as well just start taking things.
Yeah, the careless lies too, right? I mean, the number of things if someone questioned you that your mother was doing the army's work in Afghanistan, that you would have to know that you wouldn't know is, makes me feel like I'm in a glass elevator. Here I have. So you have written a novel which was waved around beforehand, and I'm sure there's more than one copy at the back of the book passage, and a New York Times bestseller, hooray, which is a work of nonfiction, which is also fascinating. But in reading this book, it felt to me like your heart was in short stories. Is that?
Well, it was, as a writer, it was my first love. It was the first things that I fell in love with were stories. It was the first workshop. It's like incredible. It was Tobias Wolff's workshop when I was in Syracuse, and he let me in, kind of like pulling a kid out of the sandlot. I'd actually written 2 really bad rough drafts of things, and he let me into a graduate workshop where everybody was already publishing and was like pissed that I was allowed in. But so that, and it was a class of basically reading a lot of great stories, but reading it sort of through his eyes, having him take us through it. But yeah, so I all the way through the process of writing the other 2 books, I've been writing stories.
Do you, when you're working on something, you know it's a short story, or do you think it might be?
Oh, I know. Yeah, it's. I mean, because the novel is, the story is very sort of obsessive, and the novel. The novel has to be planned out a lot more than the story. The story I can simply think about, I can find a voice and I can find a really complicated situation. And then often I find it's very mysterious that this was really just a couple drafts, really long drafts, 4 or 5 hours, and then another one, and then I was sort of done. I mean, I did some rewriting of it, but when I'm working best with stories, it's like that. It's very mysterious, and just sort of, I put these guys in there, and then I just sort of follow what happens next. So.
Because I have questions about your drafts. I know these are very writerly questions, but I have a microphone. Because your stories are so clean. All the stories in this, you can't see any of the stitch work at all. There are beautiful sentences, and they're all useful, which is, I think, astonishing. And what do your first drafts look like? Are they a lot worse?
They're less clean. Yeah. They're not clean, and they do. But I think part of that is that I work I'm at California College of the Arts, and I've been teaching in the MFA program, and I read, as Daniel said, I like to edit my friends' work, and I review books. So I'm constantly, I sort of feel like with my extended family, there are people that can come in and fix things in your house. I can fix your paragraphs, so that's my life. But I like it, and I don't, I'm as uncomfortable with clutter on the page as other people are in a house. So.
And do you think your journalism work has helped you with that kind of? How has it helped you as a fiction writer?
Well, yeah, you need very clean sentences, kind of sometimes boring clean sentences as a newspaper writer. But yeah, I learned it was a great education of two things, and to be a lot less self-conscious about your writing, because you just have to crank out so much stuff. But it also took me out of myself after college and made me. I had a job because I worked for the Syracuse Post-Standard in a rural county, and I had to find my own stories, which is a good instinct to instill in fiction young writers, I think, is to look around you for stories, but they're not all inside. So.
Yeah.
And this was based on a phenomenon that was happening. There were people who were I'd read a sort of short newspaper account of these guys who were doing this in the Adirondacks, and then I just thought, okay, this is too good not to write about. So.
Yeah, it's wonderful how many good writers have done work in journalism, and I also, now it sounds weird that I'm putting myself in one but although I could post on my looks, I'm also very skillful. And, but I think there's a real division between writers who are starting out, and if they've had a job like journalism, in journalism you're required to find stuff that's interesting to other people.
Yes.
And if you're only coming through fiction, you're not required of that at all. I know we both teach, and that's often what you have to teach people is, I know that's very fascinating to you. And you want to think about that all day long, you may. But no one wants to open the New Yorker and find that they're not interested in it. What writers of short stories are ones that you particularly admire? I'm assuming Tobias Wolff, just because.
Tobias Wolff, John Cheever, Dan Chaon, C-H-A-O-N, who's a contemporary and good friend, but I love his stories. Mary Gateskill, T.C. Boyle, I love his stories. And Raymond Carver was the first one, early love. So.
And then there's a lot of the settings of these books are all elegantly constructed. I mean, it's you could see the Adirondacks in that story, I think, and the town and the house, which is really quite remarkable when there's so little time spent on description. And some of the other stories, there's a great one with an apartment looking out on parade floats. There's a summer cottage that's very familiar to some of the people in the story, and completely strange and unfamiliar to others. Do you think a lot about setting? I mean, you say here that the story came to you as an idea that was already set in the Adirondacks, but do you have a situation and you say, maybe I want to put it in an apartment, or maybe I want to put it out here?
Yeah, place is really important, and I sort of upstate became I came from New York City to upstate New York, and upstate New York was such a new place to be for a kid who grew up in Manhattan to suddenly be in a small rural county. But then that made, coming back to New York, I saw New York a lot more clearly too. But I always think of place, try to establish a strong sense of place. Sometimes my students, again, write, I mean, a lot of them have a strong sense of place, but some of them have things that I'm not sure where it's set, you know, and it seems to be important to know where it's set, you know, and it establishes a very particular place. So, and now, you know, I avoided writing about New York City for a while. In fact, I went to graduate school and I didn't want to be seen as a New York City kid, and I had just come from upstate, so most people thought I was from upstate New York. I was writing about it, and you know, my novel was set there, you know, and so it's sort of later that I started writing about New York City, but it's a really comfortable place for me to write now.
And then there's not a lot of West Coast in this book. Are you saving your West Coast stories?
Yeah, I've been asked that, and yeah, I'm sure they'll be at some point, but
do not the charms of California beckon your muse?
How about this? It's a great place to live, but I wouldn't run or write there.
Well, there's nothing like stopping with a cheap joke. So now, I will turn over the questioning microphone to you in the audience. And Mr. Barbash will answer your questions.
Yeah.
You mentioned you like John Cheever.
Yes.
I just read The Swimmer, and I heard that started out as a novel and became a short story. And you said you always know whether it's going to be a novel or a short story. Could you have never imagined something like that happening, possibly?
Yeah.
Think it's one thing, it turns out to be another.
Yeah. That the area of focus is small, you know, in that way, and yeah, I could see that happening. In fact, that's actually there's I'd always wanted to write a great big tennis novel, you know, and there is a tennis story in the collection that all my thinking about it and telling friends that I was writing this great big tennis novel is now a story in the collection. You're happy you're spared my tennis novel.
Are your stories about different things or like about one thing?
That's a really good question. This is Dean Wolfley asking. It's sensational. Very good question. The interesting thing is that you think that you're writing about vastly different things, and then a good reader will come back and tell you how you're basically writing the same thing over and over again because your concerns come out in each story. So I think they're completely different, but clearly they're not. So.
Right. He thinks they're different, but what does he know?
Do you have a couple stories going at once, or do you focus on one and kind of get it just the way you want it and then move on?
Well, in the draft, when you're drafting the stories, you're doing one at a time, but then I think the best place to be in as a writer is if I have 4 or 5 drafts that need completion, and then usually I can't figure something out and I can't force it, I just have to give it time and go away from it, and then, but it's such a joy to have to sit down and working on one, and what happens often is I'm completely stopped on this one. So I work on a few other stories, and then all of a sudden I think of the solution to that story while it's not in front of me. So, but I do like the feeling of having a few things at once. I don't think you could do that as you're sort of getting into it and writing your first drafts. Yeah.
How do you know when you're doing a story? Do you get to a point where you just go, this isn't going to work, or you just need to soldier through? I mean, how do you know? Where do you persevere? Or do you just always persevere, or sometimes you just check it?
Well, there's two things. I mean, when it's really bad, sometimes it can look really bad, but sometimes you think it's really good and it's not. So I went to the Yaddo colony, it's an artist colony, and I did great work there, but I thought I'd done really great work there. I came back and I told everyone I had 12 stories I'd written there. And really there are about 4 or 5 that are actually in the collection that are good, but I thought the others were just as good, and I would send them to friends, and was one friend of mine said, like, this is so bad. And I go, no, you don't understand. But I was clear-eyed. I was clear-eyed to see the merits of other things. So I was sort of blind to its faults. That's embarrassing to say, but you don't always know. But now I can see it, and they're bad, and they need to just be. Not every story needs to be. I've taken them back and shot them. So, yeah. Jason.
I'm struck by one thing. When people are discussing a short story collection, they talk about on the terms of one short story or that short story. And I'd be very interested in hearing you talk about how you actually curate the short story collection to the degree of how much time and thought you put into which order it should go into.
Yeah, that was, I always looked ahead and wondered how I would go about doing that. And it sort of fell into place in a nice way. I have like weird. I guess I tried to take my sense of how novels paced and bring it to a story. So there's certain stories that are so similar thematically that I had to space them apart. After a very intense story, I might want to have a funny story. There's the most violent story is the second to last, which is kind of where it would go. Like a moment of intense violence in a novel might be at that spot, you know, and then the last story sort of brings you back into the world in a way. So I was thinking about these things, but I worried about it. And then there are a lot of there are stories that were published that didn't make it into the collection. There were other repeats of other things, or they just weren't as good as I wanted. But it was a fun. It was an interesting process. Like yeah, I mean, there are a lot of different things that come, mostly about not having too much of the same thing all together and spacing things out. But it's tricky. Yes, my sister, Lisa.
Can you talk about the balance between description and dialogue, and when you think some kind of explication calls for dialogue and when it calls for description?
Yeah. I mean, that's always the big struggle, is what you dramatize and what you sort of what you describe. And I guess dialogue has to earn its way into a story. The idea is, I always teach, Frank Conroy had this concept that he taught us called abject naturalism. And he said that that abject naturalism are the things that you say, like, hey, how are you? It's been hot lately, hasn't it? You know, it's what people say, but it's really boring, so it shouldn't be. So dialogue should always, he said, carry conflict and inadvertent characterization. So it should bring out something in the character and should further the conflict, and if it doesn't, it can't be in there. So yeah, so you're constantly, I mean, in early drafts you usually have people talk a lot and then you strip it away, you know, and then just keep the stuff that's really strong in terms of dialogue, and you're better off in those sections. But the nice thing is, if people have heard heavy sections of summary and description, and you look ahead at dialogue, it looks like an oasis when you're out at sea. It looks like a nice place you can just relax because the prose has gotten too dense. So I think about that too.
Yeah, when you turn the page too, that's what I think.
Yeah.
You know, there's a long descriptive paragraph, and then you turn the page, and you don't see any dialogue at all.
Yes, and then it's just,
and then they think, what time is this?
Exactly. Yeah.
Whenever I read a writer that I really like, I become kind of obsessed with all the reviews. So I read a bunch of reviews of yours because I wish I was a writer, so I try to figure out everyone's process. Thank you. Anyway, so many reviewers describe your work as dark, and I'm so shocked by that. One of my favorite things about your writing is there's such an underlying, I think, optimism to everything that you're writing, and I wonder if you think that. Or
yeah, I was thinking about the idea of like, yeah, my characters have pretty complicated lives and pretty big problems they're dealing with, but that sort of means that they need to act in some way or another. I mean, a friend of mine wrote me a little line, said, would you want to hear the story about the kid who got to school on time and the veal cutlets were thawed in time and they made a nice, you know, it's just not that interesting. And he goes, that's a Facebook post, so I suppose that he said, your stories are the things that people leave out of their Facebook posts. They're just a nice, you know, thought. But it's, yeah, I mean, in terms of being optimistic, I think my characters often avoid truths, you know, but they do it in a kind of resourceful way, and they're heading for disaster probably because of it. But I think there's something valiant. You know, there's somebody who's, I mean, there's a whole bunch of people who really have lost things and haven't dealt with it yet, and then they're living their life. It might be slightly, I mean, the payment will be due at some point, but in the meantime, they're struggling and fighting, and yeah, and there is some optimism, I hope. Thanks. Yeah.
Are any of your characters based on anyone you know or any?
Mostly on you, Christy. They sometimes are. I mean, they're and sometimes I don't even know where they are. And then, I mean, some of them, there are elements of autobiography that I'm not aware of, and it comes through. But certainly, yeah. I mean, it's hard to create them out of whole cloth. So yeah, so you do it. And I remember being in graduate school and having people guess that they were in my stories. You know? And it was like, no, I'm sorry. Yeah, sure.
It seemed, excuse me, it seemed to me that one of the things that made that story you read so powerful was that it was in the first person. And it seemed to me also that that was probably the most difficult way to tell that story. That you really took a really big chance in doing that. It's hard to narrate from the bad guy's point of view, I think. And so I'm just wondering, did you ever think? Was there any moment when you thought maybe I should be telling the story in the third person, or did it always come to you as the first person?
See, the thing about it is I never saw him as the bad guy. I mean, he never wanted to steal those things. Like, I feel like he's doing it because he thinks these people have made themselves. He really doesn't want to be a con man. I mean, and so if you don't want to be a con man, you should be a really bad one, so you'll be found out. So I mean, a lot of these are elements probably of myself, you know, in them. So watch out if I try to sell you real estate. But yeah, I liked him and a lot of the characters I think that other people like, they've asked me about being likable. I like them intensely, but they, you know, and I feel like he's just struggling because he's got nobody, you know, and he's doing these things, but I think he's likable.
Well, you humanize him, and I think that's one of the reasons why it's hard to narrate from a bad guy's point of view, because if you're going to do it, you've got to humanize that person and make him a full person, you know, not just a bad guy. And you do that. I mean, this guy, in the end, you do like him, and that's what makes the story so good, I think.
Thank you, Jerry. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, because but I think he's humanized by Mrs. Berner, you know, by someone else who's sort of seen this element of him, and you know, and there's a kind of tossed away line that Eddie gives him, that you're somebody's son, and that ends up being really sort of central to him, that is he somebody's son, you know, and needs to be in some way, so, yeah.
Yeah.
Hi, perhaps I was a little remiss in not reading the tennis story last night at courtside. But I really, really loved the story, it was great.
Oh, thanks.
And kind of thought about that mother all evening. Disturbing, but a beautiful.
Thanks. Yeah, that's one of the New York stories. Yeah, it's the first one in the collection, and again, it's a character who sort of follows her son around on dates, so which is potentially unlikable, but I hope that she's likable too.
And a great use of third person. All of the stories are wonderful in this book, and it's really quite remarkable to me how different and wide-ranging the stories are, and yet how cohesive it is. They're about one thing and a lot of things. So thank you very much for coming. Mr. Barbash will be signing books and taking more of your compliments at the table.
Thank you.